Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about the auto-resolve in Total War Warhammer 3. The things you need to know, what are the situations where you want to avoid auto-resolving, and where are the situations where you may want to auto-resolve because it is a benefit. Let's go over the pros and cons. So I have Thorgrim Grudgebearer here with his army, and this is the start of a new campaign. And if I move him against this army of greenskins, and I auto-resolve this particular battle. This is on legendary very hard battle difficulty. If I were to fight this battle manually, I may take a bit of damage on Thorgrim, but otherwise I would escape this battle largely unscathed. However, if I auto-resolve it, even though it says casualties low, I will take more damage than I would. Now, how can you go through that? Let's say you're starting a campaign or you're starting multiple campaigns. You don't want to fight every single minor battle, or you don't want to fight every single minor settlement battle. Well, one of the things you can do is you can set temporarily the battle difficulty to easy. This will approach a similar level of casualties, at least for these kind of early game battles. It will approach a similar kind of level of casualties that you may take if you fight them manually. And even then, even on easy, you are going to take a bit more damage than you would if you were to fight it manually. There is, of course, another downside to auto-resolving over here. And that downside comes down to down to the post-battle loot that you do get. Basically, if you're fighting a battle manually and you do even remotely of a decent job, you will earn more money than you would, and maybe even some special faction resources like oath gold that the dwarves have. You will generally earn more of that than if you auto-resolve it, even on the lowest possible difficulty. And on top of that, and this is with the idea that you're fighting the battle manually on very hard, as opposed to just auto-resolving on easy. But on top of that, there's also the question of experience. Oh yeah. See, you will earn generally less experience, especially for your units, not necessarily for your heroes, but you will generally earn less experience for your units if you're auto-resolving, and especially so on a lower difficulty. That is just how the game currently is. So when it comes to these kind of battles, although you can auto-resolve it and use easy difficulty to auto-resolve it and make your life easier instead of spending minutes in pointless easy battles, there are going to be downsides. There's going to be downsides in experience, there's going to be downsides in gold, there's going to be downsides in casualties. Far better from all those perspectives to actually fight these battles manually. The tactics are fairly simple. One of the things I would say is that you can allow the AI to blob up on your lord or hero or both. It's very easy to just send them ahead of your army. Then once they're all massed together, use your ranged units, even if it's just a couple of quarrelers over here. Use your ranged units to hit the enemy. Also, you get gyro bombers in this case, for instance. Artillery also helps a great deal when it comes to that. So, in terms of these early game battles, it is much better to fight them manually than it is to auto-resolve. But not in every situation. And it should also be noted that it will never change when it comes to auto-resolve outcomes. That generally fighting these battles manually, even on even if you set the auto-resolve on a lower difficulty, is generally going to be better to fight these battles manually, even on the highest difficulty, than it is to auto-resolve them on the lowest possible difficulty throughout the course of a campaign. Another thing that I should mention over here when it comes to messing around with the battle difficulty, because the auto-resolve is determined, the auto-resolve chance that you have as a player is determined by the battle difficulty you choose. They changed this in Warhammer 3. Initially, when Warhammer 3 came out, it was tied to campaign difficulty. That's changed. But one thing to mention, one thing that I've noticed, because I've done a lot of testing when it comes to this, is if you set the battle difficulty to easy and the turn on easy, the AI behavior is going to be fairly different than it would be if you've set it on very hard. I do notice some fairly substantial changes in the way that AI does various actions. Point of fact, I'm going to go with Axe Lord. So just bear in mind that if you do decide to mess around with the auto-resolve, with the battle difficulty and to get better auto-resolve results, there are consequences for that. Even if you do set it back to very hard at the end of the turn, I have seen some kind of different behavior. It is a bit weird to think about it from that perspective, but it is just something I have personally noticed when it comes to how the AI behaves in the game. So yeah, most of the time, the vast majority of times, unless you want to just have a faster campaign, it is better to fight these battles manually. You'll get a lot better options, and you'll get the better performing AI. Though, yeah, it is a bit silly, or really silly, that the same kind of battle result, that I get a better result if I fight battles manually on very hard, as opposed to auto-resolving them on easy. It says something about the system, I feel. That said, there are situations, quite a few of them, where you should actually auto-resolve. Now, one such situation actually relates to siege battles. The AI has a tendency, if they're down to their last settlement, as Karsnik is over here, to get one lord inside the settlement itself, and then get a lord right outside. Now, if I attack the lord outside, right, this will be a close victory. The battle difficulty is very hard in this situation. Now, if I fight this battle manually, here's what will happen. If I fight him manually, I can either rush this fellow right here, kill him before they arrive, but then I have to fight the siege battle. If I wait for the reinforcements, I will do some damage, but I'll also take some damage in return, and many of these guys will also escape. Instead, if I just auto-resolve it, here's what happens if I just auto-resolve it on the army outside of the settlement. Here's the outcome. The entire enemy army, the garrison, the army inside the settlement, they get wiped out. And I can gain a good amount of oath gold and a decent amount of money. And then I can go in and sack the settlement itself without having to deal with a battle inside of it. By the way, worth saying, if you're playing Forgrim, that you do have a grudge to kill Skarsnik, but if you just outright kill him, you're not going to get that Master Rune of Spite. Instead, you'll get Zilch. I mean, you'll deal with the grudge, and generally speaking, you may want to do that, but if you want the Master Rune of Spite, and let's be honest, who doesn't, then it is just best to sack the settlement multiple times over. Or just to wait with Skarsnik. Either way, just outright killing Skarsnik is probably your worst option. But in terms of battles, just fighting, like auto-resolving against an enemy stack outside of the settlement is the best possible option if you can win that auto-resolve without losing units. Now, many times the AI will have such a powerful force that you may lose a substantial portion of your army. But even then, unless you have so many ranged units that you can abuse the crap out of the garrison and the siege mechanics, it may be better to auto-resolve that even on the highest difficulty, just because auto-resolving completely eliminates the enemy army. Or the vast majority of times when you do auto-resolve, and the only exception I currently see with that is when you're dealing with the vampire counts, because they generally tend to survive an auto-resolve. But with the exception of the vampire counts, most of the time when you're auto-resolving, be it whether or not you're winning or losing, the army you have, the army you're fighting, the loser loses everything. Be it yourself or the AI, they lose everything. This is a great situation in this kind of scenario because you're not fighting inside the settlement. You're fighting outside the settlement, so you don't have to deal with the walls, the narrow choke points, all that kind of stuff. It certainly helps make the campaign a lot better, and a lot of these battles easier. Though, to be fair, if I do have a full range stack, not like here, but if once I do get a full range stack, now that my barracks is level 2, I may actually prefer to fight the settlement battle, the siege battle, because I can use range units to just kill everything inside without taking any real casualties, or kill a significant portion of the enemy, so that even when they do sally out, I'll be in a great position to wipe them out. Now, another situation where you may want to auto-resolve, provided you can win the battle, is something similar to this. Though not this particular example, because I've cornered Vlad and Drakenhof here, I could just take my army, burn down his walls, and win. But one of the things I would absolutely not want to do is face Vlad with a full stack on an open field battle. I've faced Vlad on an open field battle with some other factions, even with Ungram, and it tends to end up being very messy. But why is that? Well, the vampire counts don't do so very well in terms of their auto-resolve chance, but they do very well when it comes to their actual battle prowess. But how is that? Well, Vlad and Isabella have a nifty little ability here, fear. And so, if you're fighting with many armies, though not this Slayer army, but even the armies that I have here would be affected by this, because yeah, Slayers are immune, but the other units aren't. They have the ability to absolutely rout my entire army. On top of that, here's another thing. On top of that, it is very, very hard to actually kill them. Like, beyond the fact that they're causing constant fear, constant issues with the leadership in your army, like he's causing fear and terror. Not only is that something you're constantly dealing with in a battle, but on top of that, it is an absolute nightmare. Like, Vlad himself, Vlad and Isabella on their own can absolutely kill entire stacks of your own troops. In fact, if I were to attack with all of this, I'm not so certain that if I were to attack with all of this, I'm not so certain I would be able to escape unscathed. Assuming I moved past the walls and assuming I didn't just kill large portions of Vlad's entire army with just purely range units sniping his army from outside the walls. Like, if I moved 2 entire stacks, Slayers, Ungrim, I'm not certain I could win this. But if I had to resolve it, then I do know for certain that I do win. And this applies to any situation you may encounter where you've got fear, terror, powerful heroes. Just auto-resolving in that kind of context can give you some fairly significant advantages. Though, in this particular case, this wasn't necessarily the best example, I'll be honest, because in this particular case, it would have probably been better had I actually just fought them manually and used range units. But it is better to auto-resolve in that situation as opposed to sending your melee units through, just because of the leadership effect. This also applies to dealing with Draika. The best way to deal with Vlad and Draika is not to fight them in an even battle. Rather, it is to end up in a situation where you vastly outnumber them on the campaign map, and you can auto-resolve and win using that. Even then, I still took fairly substantial casualties with my units, or to lure them into a wall, into a major settlement. So you siege them, take them out with pure range units, and win the day. Those are some of your options. Now, here's some things that do matter when it comes to your auto-resolve chance. What does the auto-resolve care about? Well, here's some of the things I've noticed. The auto-resolve cares about statistics, but it does feel like it values some statistics far more than others. One of the things it cares about is armor. So, Ungrim actually is probably the worst dwarf legendary lord in the game right now. His slayers tend to take a lot of damage in both regular battles and auto-resolve battles, like far more damage. Like, I should, like, with 2 full stacks with all the units that I had there, yeah, that shouldn't have even been a question of who I was going to be, who was going to win, but it was. It was. So he's actually not really worth playing, but because his slayers have 0 armor, which means that in an auto-resolve situation, hell, even in a regular battle, his units are going to take significantly more damage. But another thing that does matter and actually benefits him is leadership, because, yeah, his slayers may have 0 armor, zilch for armor, but they have the best leadership in the game. They can't be broken at all, and that's something that the auto-resolve values highly. It's a trade-off. So the best units in terms of an auto-resolve scenario are units with high armor, high leadership. This is one of the advantages dwarves have always had in Total War Warhammer. One of the reasons that the AI dwarves in Warhammer 2 tend to do so well is precisely for this reason. And in point of fact, this is something that continues in Warhammer 3. There are many battles where, for instance, the Skaven, just to give an example, like you've got Clan Rictus over here. If you're playing as Forgrim or Ungrim, chances are Tretch is going to attack you. But what may be a bit surprising to hear is that even on the highest battle difficulty, you can absolutely auto-resolve, assuming he's coming at you with just an army of Skaven slaves. Partly because when you're on the defensive, anyone who's on the defensive gets an auto-resolve benefit, and partly because dwarven units are heavily armored bastards, like even the regular miners have as much armor as Jade Warriors, just to give you an idea. But even dwarven miners have just as much armor as Jade Warriors. Not as good, to be clear, as Jade Warriors, of course, but still, they can absolutely hold their own, which means that they punch far above their weight when it comes to auto-resolve, and certainly far above what they might be able to achieve if you do fight these kind of battles manually. Armor and leadership, like it generally just comes down to stats, but I do find that high armor or high leadership, or ideally both, which many dwarven units do have, that's going to count for the most when it comes to your auto-resolve chance. And improving your odds, reducing the casualties that you're going to take, giving you better results overall. And that's all there is really to say about it. Just be aware, like it's really good if you can auto-resolve a situation like against the Vampire Counts or against Draco or Durfu, since he's going to have a lot of Treekin. It's not so great to auto-resolve battles where, especially early game battles, because post-battle loot, sieges tend to not favor an auto-resolve outcome because of the defensive advantage. Like, you can win a siege, like, honestly, if I had fought this siege manually, for instance, I would have won it without, like, taking any actual casualties, but I wanted to mention, to use Vlad as an example for the fear and terror, because if you fight them on an open field, that's very, that can be a nightmare. So, like, when dealing with armies of fear, terror, or both, tend to prefer auto-resolving. If you're dealing with sieges, prefer manually fighting. If you're on the attack, if you're on the attack with a ranged army, in that case, and you can find the blind spot. Though keep in mind that while something like Drakenhof has a ranged blind spot, and I certainly had artillery, 4 units of artillery here. While it has a blind spot, not all settlements will have those blind spots, and not all factions will get as easy access to artillery as the dwarves can get. So it's always something that depends on the battlefield itself, where you have to decide that. But yeah, most of the time I'd say auto-resolve is not worth it, but there are some situations like where you're auto-resolving to annihilate an enemy army, because as opposed to fighting manually, because if you fight them manually, generally some units will escape. So if you can auto-resolve it, like if you can catch an enemy army outside of a settlement and auto-resolve that, that's better than fighting the battle, even if you lose some units. Because you might win the battle outside the settlement with no casualties, but then you have to assault the settlement, and that may cause casualties. Depends on the army you have. For instance, Ungrum, who only starts with the Slayer Shrine and Karakadrin, and has to build other recruitment structures, he may have some issues getting ready access to the range unit mass. He needs to trivialize a lot of the siege battles. So it depends on the situation. Anyway, Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.